Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're tackling a question that I think is on a lot of our minds these days, which is why are so many students struggling?
Yeah, it's a big one. And it feels like a really urgent question too, you know?
Absolutely. And we're going to try to dig a little deeper into not just the causes of some of these struggles that students are facing, but also why some of the solutions that we've come up with, well, haven't quite worked out the way we hoped.
Yeah.
And for this deep dive, we are looking at a blog post by Dr. Howie Knoff, who is the president of Project Achieve Educational Solutions. And he's really pushing back against this idea of these kind of quick fixes in education.
Right.
And his blog post was actually sparked by an interview that featured Sharon Hoover, who's a professor of child and adolescent psychiatry. And that interview was in Education Week.
Yeah, and I think what's so fascinating about both of these folks' perspectives is that they're both really highlighting this trend that we see everywhere, and not just in education, which is this urge to oversimplify complex problems.
Right.
And, you know, on the one hand, it makes sense. We want to kind of boil things down to something we can easily understand and address. But when you're dealing with something as nuanced as supporting students, that oversimplification can really backfire.
It's like when we think about like, oh, let's just add another lane to the highway and that'll solve traffic.
Exactly.
It doesn't deal with all the other reasons that there's traffic.
Right. And Professor Hoover really pushes back against that in her interview. And she specifically says, you know, when we're talking about student mental health, we can't just point the finger at social media and say that's the culprit.
Right.
We need to kind of step back and do what she calls a root cause analysis, which I love that term because it really brings to mind kind of a medical model, right? Just like a doctor wouldn't just prescribe medication without figuring out what's actually causing your symptoms. We need to do the same thing in education. We need to figure out the root cause of a student's struggles before we can even begin to think about intervening.
And that's where things get really tricky, right? Because she lays out this pretty extensive list of potential root causes for why students are struggling.
Yeah.
She talks about bullying, you know, both online and in person, the pressure to succeed academically, worrying about college and future careers, school safety concerns, the threat of violence, gender identity, physical health issues like sleep, diet, exercise, even things like poverty, grief, the impact of current events.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really long list.
It is. And the important takeaway there is that each of these root causes demands a very different response.
Right.
Right. It'd be like going to the doctor and they just had one treatment for everything.
Right.
Whether you had a broken leg or the flu or a heart condition. You know, same thing in education. You need the right tool for the job, so to speak. And that means understanding what's at the heart of each student's challenges.
Yeah, and this is where Dr. Knockoff in his blog post really points out that if we apply the wrong intervention, if we don't know what that root cause is,
Right.
we can actually end up making things worse. And he has this great quote where he says, "Implementing intervention is not a benign act, it is a strategic act."
It's so true.
Yeah.
You know, it really drives home the point that we have to be thoughtful and intentional about how we approach supporting students.
Right, and it's this bigger issue, right, that we're talking about of oversimplification in education.
Yeah.
Like we have this urge to boil things down, make them digestible, make them, you know, easy to implement. But I think as Dr. Knopf points out, when we oversimplify solutions, we often end up with inconsistent implementation.
Right.
You know, different schools, different teachers are going to do things differently. The approaches end up being incomplete because we've cut corners, we've skipped steps, the support that we put in place isn't adequate, and ultimately the strategies just don't work because they're not targeted enough, they're not tailored enough to the actual needs of the students.
It's like trying to bake a cake with only half the ingredients.
Right. No.
You know, you might end up with something that vaguely resembles a cake, but it's not going to be very good.
Exactly. And I think this is where it's helpful to talk about multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS.
Okay. Yeah. Have you heard of this before?
I have.
Okay.
We could
So,
talk in a minute.
so for our listeners who might not be as familiar with this, can you kind of break down what MTSS is and how it works in practice?
Sure. So imagine you have a pyramid with 3 tiers, right?
Okay.
At the base of the pyramid, you have what's called Tier 1, and this is all about universal supports. So this is where the school makes sure that all students have access to high-quality instruction, a positive learning environment, and they're doing regular assessments to monitor student progress.
So like preventative care.
Exactly. Like we want to make sure that every student has a strong foundation, right?
Yeah.
But then we know that some students are going to need more support than others. So that's where Tier 2 comes in, and this involves more targeted interventions. So this might be things like small group instruction, some specialized counseling services, or maybe a behavioral support program. And the key here is that these interventions are really tailored to the individual needs of the student. So it's like if you go to your primary care doctor and they can't quite figure out what's wrong, so they send you to a specialist.
Exactly. You need a more focused approach, right?
Right.
And then finally, at the very top of the pyramid, we have Tier 3. And this is for students with the most significant needs. So this is where things get really individualized student. Students might receive one-on-one tutoring, comprehensive evaluations, or even what are called wraparound services, which involve collaboration between the school, the family, and the community. It's really about bringing in all the resources necessary to support that student.
This makes sense, but isn't this what schools should be doing anyway?
Right. You would think so.
Like, isn't this their job?
Yeah, and here's the interesting thing. Federal law actually does mandate that schools have a multi-tiered system of support, but it doesn't tell them exactly how to do it.
Oh.
So you end up with a lot of variation in how MTSS is actually implemented across different schools and districts.
So that's where this problem of oversimplification that we've been talking about comes back into play.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Dr. Knoff has seen this firsthand in his work with schools. And he says, even when schools start with a really comprehensive MTSS framework, fear often takes over. Administrators start to worry that the process is too long, too complex, too time-consuming, and they might get pushback from teachers who are already feeling overwhelmed.
So instead of sticking to the plan, they start trying to simplify things.
Exactly. They strip away details, they try to make it easier, faster, and, what happens? The comprehensive plan ends up on a shelf gathering dust.
Right. It's kind of ironic, right? Because they're trying to make things easier for everyone, but by oversimplifying, they actually end up creating a system that's less likely to succeed.
And what's even more concerning is that this simplification can lead to inconsistent practices, right? So if teachers aren't given clear guidance and support, they might interpret and implement interventions in vastly different ways. And that's where we really start to see a breakdown in fidelity.
Okay, so before we go any further, I think we need to talk about this word fidelity, because I think it's a really important concept, and it's one that often gets misunderstood. Can you explain what we mean by fidelity in the context of education?
Sure. So it's more than just doing things the right way, right? It's about making sure that the interventions we're using are aligned with research, that they've actually been proven to work.
Yeah.
It's about sticking to the plan monitoring data to see if it's having the intended effect and making adjustments as needed.
So it's about being really thoughtful and intentional and data-driven.
Exactly.
In our approach.
We're not just throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping something sticks, right?
Right. And to kind of illustrate how absurd it is to try to oversimplify these really complex processes, Dr. Knoff uses some great analogies in his blog post. He says, imagine asking a surgeon to condense a really complex operation into like a single page of cliff notes.
Oh, wow.
Or picture a conductor who's trying to reduce an entire four-movement symphony down to a single sheet of music.
You'd get some pretty strange results.
Right, and I think that's Dr. Knoff's point. We wouldn't tolerate that level of oversimplification in other fields. So why do we accept it in education?
Right. It's almost as if we've forgotten that teaching and learning are complex processes, and they deserve the same level of care and attention as any other profession.
And that's really what fidelity is all about. It's about respecting that complexity and committing to doing things in a way that actually benefits students.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to explore even further in the next part of our deep dive.
So stay with us. We'll be right back.
It's like we almost expect teachers to perform miracles with one hand tied behind their backs.
Yeah.
We give them these incredibly complex tasks and then tell them to simplify, simplify, simplify.
And it's not just teachers, right? I mean, this pressure to oversimplify seems like it kind of permeates the entire education system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Dr. Knoff gives all these examples in his blog post of how this plays out in different areas. Imagine asking a superintendent to condense a strategic plan for an entire district onto a single page.
Right. Or telling the chief financial officer, they have to fit a multi-million-dollar budget summary onto a single sheet of paper.
Exactly. It sounds ridiculous when you put it like that, right?
Yeah.
But then we turn around and we ask teachers to cram an entire semester's worth of Shakespeare into a 20-minute lesson plan.
Right.
Or we pressure school psychologists to reduce comprehensive special education assessments into one-page abstracts. I mean, does any of that sound familiar?
I think if you've spent any time working in education, you've probably felt that pressure.
Absolutely. And this is exactly what Dr. Knoff is getting at in his post. He says, and I'm quoting him directly here, whether it is an in-house district or school process or an outsourced consultation or professional development, detail and integrity matter.
Mm.
We can't just pick and choose when we value fidelity. It has to be a core principle that guides everything we do in education.
But like we were talking about before the break, it seems like the word fidelity has almost become a dirty word in education.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. I mean, part of it might be that it's been misinterpreted. People hear fidelity and they think it means you have to follow a script rigidly with no room for flexibility or creativity.
So it's seen as like being restrictive and limiting.
Exactly. But true fidelity isn't about being inflexible. It's about understanding the core components of an intervention or a program and making sure that those components are implemented with intention and consistency.
It's about being responsive to data, right?
Absolutely. Making adjustments as needed. It's more about being thoughtful and adaptable than it is about blindly following a set of rules.
Okay, so it's not about like just checking boxes. It's about really understanding the why behind what you're doing.
Exactly. And I think another reason fidelity gets a bad rap is because it requires effort.
Yeah.
It's easier to just kind of wing it or to take shortcuts, especially when you're feeling overwhelmed and stressed.
Right.
But as we've been discussing, those shortcuts can often lead to much bigger problems down the road.
So how do we start to shift this mindset?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, how do we make fidelity less scary and more appealing to educators?
Well, I think professional development is a big part of it.
Okay.
We need to help teachers and administrators understand what fidelity really means and why it's so important. But we also need to provide them with the resources and support they need to actually implement things with fidelity.
And that might mean giving them more time, more training, even just more encouragement and recognition for the hard work that they're doing.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to create a culture of collaboration and shared learning. When educators feel supported and respected, they're more likely to buy into this idea of fidelity.
Right. So it's about creating a system where fidelity is seen as a shared responsibility.
Exactly. Not something that's imposed from the top down.
Right.
And that's where leadership really comes in.
Yeah.
School leaders have to set the tone and create an environment where fidelity is truly valued and supported.
But it's not just about telling people to do things a certain way, right?
Absolutely not.
It's about empowering them to make informed decisions.
Yes.
To adapt interventions to their specific context,
Well,
but to still maintain that fidelity to the core principles.
It requires trust.
Yeah.
We have to trust educators to use their professional judgment and make decisions that are in the best interests of their students.
And I love how Dr. Knoff puts it in his blog post. He says, and this really struck me, he asks, if we're not dedicated to making data-informed decisions and implementing interventions with fidelity, are we truly dedicated to our students and their best interests?
Wow. Yeah, that's a powerful question.
It is.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it?
It does, because at the end of the day, it's all about the students, right? So it's about creating a system that supports them and helps them reach their full potential.
And that's why fidelity is so important.
Yeah.
It's not just about following rules or checking boxes. It's about doing what's best for kids.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about what it actually looks like to move beyond this oversimplification and embrace a more nuanced approach to education. What are some concrete steps that schools and educators can take to actually make this happen?
Well, I think one of the most important things is just acknowledging the complexity of the challenges that we're facing. We can't pretend that there are easy answers or quick fixes. We have to be willing to grapple with the messiness and embrace the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
So letting go of that idea that everything has to be simple and easy to understand.
Exactly. And recognizing that even well-intentioned interventions can have unintended consequences if they're not implemented thoughtfully and with fidelity.
And that quote from Dr. Knoff that we mentioned earlier, implementing intervention is not a benign act, it is a strategic act. It's just a good reminder that every decision we make in education has the potential to really shape the lives of these young people. We have to be mindful of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have to be constantly evaluating our practices and making adjustments as needed. We can't just assume that something's working because it sounds good in theory.
So being data-driven and constantly kind of learning and evolving.
Absolutely. We have to be open to new ideas and willing to admit when something isn't working.
And I think that ties back to what we were talking about earlier about empowering educators.
Yeah.
They need to feel comfortable speaking up when they see something that's not working or when they have a new idea for how to do something better.
Absolutely. So instead of these top-down mandates,
Yay.
it's about creating a culture of feedback and continuous improvement.
So more collaborative and less hierarchical.
Right. And I think it's also about recognizing the value of different perspectives.
Mhm.
We need to hear from teachers, students, parents, community members, anyone who has a stake in the success of our schools.
So bring everyone to the table.
Yes.
And really try to work together to create a system that serves everyone.
That's the goal.
Yeah, and that's really what Dr. Knoff is calling for in this blog post. He's saying we need to step up. We need to demand better for our students, for our teachers, for our communities.
Absolutely.
And that we all have a responsibility to advocate for a system that values complexity,
Yes.
that values fidelity, and most importantly, values the well-being of every single student.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And I really hope that message resonates with everyone who listens to this deep dive.
As we wrap up this part of the deep dive, I think it's important to remember that, this is an ongoing conversation.
Yes.
And we're not going to solve all the problems of education in one episode, but hopefully this has given our listeners some food for thought.
Absolutely.
And maybe even inspired some folks to, take action in their own sphere of influence.
I agree. This is a conversation that needs to continue in our schools, our communities, and really in our society as a whole.
Yeah.
Because the future of education really does depend on our willingness to embrace this complexity and to commit to doing what's best for all students.
So stay with us. We'll be back after a quick break to wrap up this deep dive and explore some final thoughts on how we can all work together to create a better future for education. It's funny, we talk about all these really complex challenges in education, but I think one of the biggest hurdles is really a pretty simple idea, like changing our mindset.
I agree with that. We've been kind of trained to think that efficiency means simplifying everything, but as we've seen sometimes, that most efficient approach is the one that's actually willing to kind of lean into the complexity a little bit.
And Dr. Knoff makes this really interesting analogy in his blog post. He asks us to think about what would happen if we tried to cut corners when we were building a bridge.
Oh, yeah. You're going to have a disaster on your hands.
Yeah.
Right? A bridge that's unstable, unsafe, and probably much more costly to fix in the long run.
Exactly. And it's the same thing in education. If we try to oversimplify these crucial processes, we end up with these systems that are just as unstable and ineffective as that poorly built bridge.
Right. And we end up with interventions that don't work. Teachers who are burned out and ultimately students who are not getting what they need to succeed.
And that's where Dr. Knoff really argues that we can't let expediency trump quality in education. Taking shortcuts might seem tempting in the moment, but in the long run, it's a recipe for disaster.
It's like trying to save time by skipping steps in a recipe.
Right.
You might end up with something that looks like a cake, but it's not going to taste very good.
So if oversimplification is the problem, how do we start to fix this? How do we shift our mindset and actually embrace complexity in a way that benefits students?
I think it starts by recognizing that complexity isn't something to be afraid of. It's just a reflection of the reality that we're dealing with. Human beings are complex. Learning is complex. The challenges facing our schools are complex.
So instead of pretending that we can reduce everything to a simple formula or a checklist, we need to be willing to kind of sit with that messiness and embrace the nuance.
Exactly. And I think that requires a shift in our language as well. Instead of asking, how can we make this easier? We should be asking, what will it take to do this right?
Ooh, I love that.
It's about focusing on quality and effectiveness, not just speed and efficiency.
Yeah, it's not about just getting it done.
Right.
It's about getting it done right.
Exactly. And recognizing that sometimes doing things right takes time, effort, resources.
Yeah.
But it's an investment worth making because the stakes are so high.
Right. We're talking about the future of our kids.
Yeah, the future of our society.
Yeah. And I think Dr. Knoff's blog post really is a call to action.
Absolutely.
For anyone who cares about education, he's saying we need to step up. We need to demand better.
Yes.
For our students, for our teachers, for our communities.
And that might mean having some tough conversations.
Yeah.
Challenging the status quo, pushing back against this pressure to oversimplify.
But ultimately, it's about doing what's right even when it's hard. It's about advocating for a system that values complexity, that values fidelity, and most importantly, values the well-being of every single student.
Beautifully said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I just want to leave our listeners with one final thought. Think about your own sphere of influence, whether that's your school, your workplace, your community, and ask yourself, what is one small step that you can take today to push back against oversimplification
Mm.
and advocate for a more nuanced and thoughtful approach? Maybe it's speaking up at a meeting, sharing this episode with a colleague, or just reflecting on your own practices and recommitting to doing things with more intentionality and fidelity.
Those small acts of resistance can really add up.
They can, and collectively we have the power to create an education system that's worthy of our children and our future.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive, and we hope you'll join us next time as we continue to explore the complexities of the world and the ideas that shape our lives.